Well, David, there are 5 Sports Direct Premiership games on Saturday with 1 on Friday night. We'll start with Saturday's games. We're going to go to Mourneview Park for Glenavon versus Crusaders because it's 2 teams that aren't on great form. Glenavon haven't picked up a single point so far this season. Paddy McLaughlin, we've had him in the studio. He was fantastic when he came in here, but he must be under pressure at this point.
Well, let's start with Glenavon and Patrick McLaughlin. The pressure that it will be under will be no greater than the pressure that he's putting on himself. That's the long and short of it. When you're in that situation, there's always noise. People will talk about your position. I don't know how many times during my career my position was being discussed. But ultimately, while you heard about that going on around you, if you're a winner and a winner the way Paddy is, then you put the pressure on yourself. I've been in record before, and I will continue. I'm not changing my stance that while there may be a pressure, Patrick McLaughlin is without 100% the right man for the job. I've got to say Barry Gray made a very worthwhile point when he talked about not just this period of the season, but last year, the period of the season, and who was manager, because it wasn't Paddy, it was Stephen O'Donnell, and the season prior to that, it was then Gary Hamilton. And he made a very good point that regardless of the change of manager, Glenavon during this first part of the season, there was, for whatever reason, things didn't go correctly. So for me, there needs stability. There needs to be, no knee-jerk reactions. And for me, they've got to just stick with Patrick without any shot of a doubt. There's been games where no matter how hard they've tried, this isn't about attitude or lack of application. Some of the things that have gone against them, you just couldn't write them. But it's a massive game for Glenavon. I would suggest that the Crusaders actually are playing and doing better in that. Obviously, yes, they've won a couple of games. I actually watched the match. I was working at the game against Ballymena. Crusaders, I tell you, Keith, they were a joy to watch. Written some of the names of the players down. Young Adam Brooks, Elliot Dunlop, Fraser Bryden, Josh Williamson. They look like a youth team, honestly.
It's a very different Crusaders team from the ones we're used to seeing, where there was a bit of long ball and a physical team. This is quite different. They're
totally different in that, okay, a lot of those senior players, have moved on, and I think there was a financial recalibration, if there's such a word, in terms of those senior players moving out and moving on and having to bring other players in. I know that Declan Cadell has talked about the challenge of having to work to a budget, so there is that impact. But those young players and how they go about their business. For 80 minutes last week against Ballymena United, Crusaders were absolutely excellent, and yet they still rely on the experience. But on experience, Jonathan Tuffy made 3, if I recount correctly, 4 saves on the day, which were absolutely critical. So they have that little bit of experience, but there certainly is more youth than there is experience. Come this weekend, Declan will demand that his young players, with young players you get inconsistency, but he will say, listen, if you can do so well at home against Ballymena United, then surely we should be going down here expecting to win, given the difficulties that Glenavon are going through. From a Glenavon perspective, they're saying, listen, Crusaders are maybe one of the teams that should be in and around us. We need to go and get full points. So I'm not exactly sure what way it will go. For me, if Glenavon can perform and get the little bit of good fortune, they could get their first victory of the season. If Crusaders reproduce what they did last week, and here's the other thing, add a better finishing, because the number of chances they created last week, then it could be Crusaders' day.
Well, at Solitude, we've got Cliftonville versus Portadown. Cliftonville, David, it's been an interesting start to the season. They're a real mixed bag. They're mid-table. They're 6th. They had 3 wins in a row, and then they went and lost to Dungannon Swifts. So just when you think the Reds had turned the corner, up pops a really disappointing result, and that's sort of been the way of it in terms of the league for the last 18 months or so for the Reds.
I watched the Cliftonville game against Ballymena United, up at Solitude. On the day, it proved what a cruel game football can be, because Ballymena United got it back to 2 each, which possibly would have been a fair result. They were down to 10 men, but Cliftonville stepped up, scored, I think, in the 3rd minute of injury time. Those are the types of days which you absolutely love, and they got a tremendous victory there. They were heading up to Dungannon, and I thought, certainly that will be an interesting encounter, but by all accounts, while the 2 men sent off, and they still contributed, but Dungannon Swifts did enough to get through. So it's one of those games where, I keep going back to the number of players that Jim Magilton has been able to retain. I keep thinking about this takeover, which has been bubbling and bubbling and bubbling, and I'm just wondering, there's, in terms of the overall inconsistency and lack of clarity about a way forward, is that having some impact? I'm not altogether sure. I don't buy into that. Players as players, you've got to go and perform, but there is an inconsistency there. Portadown, tremendous season last year. Phenomenal season. This year, finding it maybe a little bit more difficult. 3 defeats
in a row. Then on Friday night, a very disappointing 4-1 loss to Bangor. Bangor were excellent. That's not taking anything away from them, but that was a poor performance from Portadown. Something I've picked up on, Portadown fans unhappy with the formation. Portadown playing a back three. You played a back three quite a bit in your time at Ballymena. Why do you think Niall Curry's gone down that route?
But you usually change your shape, or you go with the shape because of the players you have available to you. Now, let's not forget, and this is not making excuses for Niall. Niall is big enough to stand up for himself, but there's a number of players who haven't been available to him, and you need your best players to be available and playing at their best. That's what Portadown had last year. I have had the experience where one year you do fantastically well with Ballymena, the next year not so much. And when we did the analysis, when we looked at it, it was about availability of your best players, and then it was about your best players playing to their best. They're not getting that this year, and certainly Bangor have got all of the confidence of a newly promoted side. They thoroughly deserved their victory the previous week. I think it was Coleraine who were in town, to Portadown, and their class just shone. But listen, it's very early in the season. The players that now haven't suddenly become poor players, Keith. Yeah. They haven't, so they just need some of their injured players back. They need that little bit of injection of confidence. And to answer your question, you play a system which suits the players that you have available to you. I've played with 4 at the back. I've played with 3 at the back. I've played with 5 at the back. But you could go on to your blue in the face about shape and system, whatever else. Ultimately, it's down to players performing. That's what it's about.
I do think Clifton will come out on top. It's hard to look past them in that one. David, at the showgrounds, Ballymena United versus Dungannon Swifts.
Well, some people might have thought that Jim Irvine was maybe harsh on his players after the result down at Seaview. I would not be one of those. I would be backing him 110%. I was working at the game, Ballymena United against Linfield. Ballymena were resolute. They were resilient on the counter-attack. They were excellent. They defended if their lives depended upon it. The work rate that was put in that night was phenomenal. And yet, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that they went purposely with a poor attitude to Crusaders, but Crusaders absolutely dominated. And Jim sort of talked about being relieved at least coming away with a point. The message, and he gets it because he played at Linfield and knows what it's like, and then played against Linfield, and obviously has managed against them as well. And I'm going to use this analogy, and please go with me, folks. I remember when I first joined Ards, and then when I left Ards and went to Larne as a player. When you were playing Linfield and to maybe another extent Glentoran, average in that week of training leading up to the game, average players became good players became very good players, and very good players became excellent players. And I could never work out why there was such a raise in the quality of their application and their training. And then when it came to the game, I couldn't just work that out, because for me, having been brought up the way I was brought up, and that was obviously mostly under Roy Coyle, absolutely every game you had to be up for it. End of story. You set your own personal standard as a player, and you went out and you carried that out. So Jim, for me, was quite right to say, listen, there's no point going and doing what you did against, Linfield, and then not turning in, a similar performance against Crusaders. Now, Crusaders were excellent. Don't get me wrong, but on the day, Ballymena were a pale shadow of themselves in terms of the side that played against Linfield. Dungannon are coming in, having got that result against Cliftonville. They will want to get a little bit of momentum. Dungannon were top fourth last year. Ballymena want to hit to top sixth this year. So it's going to be an interesting battle. Can Dungannon reproduce what they did against Cliftonville, and can Ballymena United find their mojo again? I would suggest they would, because Jim made it very clear to them that what they produced against Crusaders was not acceptable.
Well, the other showgrounds, we've got Coleraine against Carrick Rangers. Coleraine, a defeat last week against Glentoran, but you have to say that they've had a great start to the season. Will Patching's just a fabulous player to watch. So I would expect Coleraine to come out and top against Carrick. On the other side of things, Carrick had a magnificent start to the season. They've dropped off a little since then. They haven't lost any of their last three. And in the middle of that last three, there was the Bangor game, which of course was abandoned. They were 1-0 down in the 50th odd minute in that game. So they've tailored off a bit. So it is difficult to look past Coleraine in that game. David, we already talked a lot about Glentoran and Larne in our previous video, which is out there on YouTube if you want to watch it. But how do you think the game between the two at the Oval will go on Saturday?
Well, a great question. I think incrementally Glentoran are building a confidence about themselves. I go back to the Big Two game. First 15, maybe 20 minutes, I was pitch side. And you could see a nervousness about Glentoran. The players were finding themselves in a new situation with regards to expectation. This being a new group of players having this expectation, and they get through that little difficult period and just grew in confidence over the piece. I think that the Glentoran will be relishing this chance, this opportunity to say, well, we're coming up against a team who's second in the table, right behind us. I think they will really be looking forward to the game. I think confidence will have grown. Interesting to see how Larne approach it. Will they go out and go toe to toe, or will they, look to sit in and maybe look to counter attack? Will they talk about let's frustrate the Glentoran supporters so that maybe they get in the players' backs? There's all of these tactics and thoughts. No, I would be surprised, given the quality of the second half performance that Glentoran produced up at Coleraine. I would be surprised if they don't get the victory.
Only one game on the Friday night this weekend, and it's a really interesting one. It's Bangor against Linfield at Mourneview Park. Linfield are a top team; they're the champions. We all know this. They had a bit of a blip against Ballymena, but they bounced back with the win over Glenavon. You would expect them to go into this game as clear favourites, and of course they are. But I have a sneaking suspicion, David, for Bangor on this one. They're flying. A great result away to Portadown last Friday night with a 4-1 win. But also, they're really strong at Mourneview Park. They're really strong on Friday nights. They're a difficult team to play against. They've Ben Arthurs is great in there, and they've added Jay Boyd to that, who's another big old lump. Yep. So they're a real threat in that department. I just think this game has all the ingredients for a shock.
Keith, you're not the first person who has suggested that to me this week, and I've got to say there's even a number of Linfield supporters in conversation said, this is going to be a real difficult one. Bangor are going to put it up to us. This is my stance on it, that in the away game at Ballymena, Linfield were disappointed in that it wasn't about their attitude, application, work rate, whatever else. It was about their creativity, on the night. And Ballymena were resolute, as I say, resilient, and deserved a win. But Linfield weren't happy with the creativity on the evening. And interesting, then David's team selection then against Glenavon left a couple of lads out just to say, listen, if you don't produce, then I'm going to use the squad. There's no better way to increase the competition that when you make changes, and the changes that you make, you end up winning, because that suddenly then allows those players who have come in, to really kick on. So I'm going to say very, very clearly that in my head and my heart that Linfield will win. Bangor will certainly put it up to them, no doubt. But I am not sharing your opinion, Mr. Bailie. Given that they had the blip against Ballymena, I would expect away from home, I would expect Linfield to win away to Bangor.
Thanks for watching Beltel Football. If you'd like to learn more about all things Irish League, don't forget to subscribe to the Belfast Telegraph YouTube channel.